So a very long time ago, back when what is now our sun was just a ball of unformed gases floating around in the sky, back when our Lord the Creator was just a neophyte supreme being, back when the late Queen of England was just a gleam in her parents' eye. Yes, all the way back then, yours truly, moi, began writing a novel, and I have just recently completed my 7th or 8th first draft of that novel. So I began work on this novel when I left the monastery many years ago, and I've been working on it ever since. And it's not necessarily the kind of project I would have felt comfortable trying to develop at the monastery. Full-time spiritual people, religious figures, priests, monks, imams, rabbis, they have an uneasy relationship with fiction. One of our A-list most capable, intelligent, and insightful priests gave a lecture once, and it was about stories and storytelling. This priest had a kind of a mistrust of the poetic. Time and time again, whenever I heard him give a talk, he would talk about how you cannot believe your own stories. So this guy, let's call him Donald. This guy, Donald, would tell us, watch out for the stories that you're telling yourself. You're probably believing things behind your back that you're not aware of, and they're causing you suffering. Donald's story winds up being Shakespearean, winds up being epic, winds up being tragic. So when we had a scandal in our community, and it involved sexual misconduct with my teacher, it was like a bomb falling right in the middle of our Sangha. And something got triggered inside of Donald, and he had this meltdown that was completely irrational, completely illogical, and completely public. In many ways, the guy's whole life started unraveling. This was absolutely not the outcome that I had imagined for this Zen priest and this teacher. He was really one of our best Oshos. Donald was a guy who didn't believe in stories and told Zen students not to believe in stories, didn't really read or like fiction, and yet he was living his life according to a certain story, completely unconscious of how totally he had swallowed whole the belief in our teacher. He had swallowed that belief so totally that it was, he didn't even see it as a story. And one of the reasons that he crashed and burned so spectacularly was because that story at the time of the scandal involving our teacher began to unravel. I've seen this a lot in Zen centers and Buddhist communities and spiritual communities with strong teachers especially. You see people who have arrived at the truth. There's no need to question it. And every other system or idea is mere fiction. One of the great gifts of being part of a community that kind of fell apart the way that my old Zen community did was watching an absolute truth become a story. I'm not here to put down spiritual communities, much less my former Zen community, much less Donald or spiritual communities in general. What I want to make a case for is the power of fiction. So every idea, philosophy, principle, system of thought in a work of fiction is always except for the most like bizarre experimental fiction, it's always fully embodied in a character whose choices you get to see, whose point of view you get to inhabit. You get to completely slip into this person's shoes. David Foster Wallace, for example, talks about how fiction helps you leap over the wall of self. And Jonathan Franzen and Zadie Smith, as well as David Foster Wallace, both talk about how fiction helps you develop empathy. And in order to do this, you have to learn how to read, right? You have to learn how to read in every sense. You have to learn how to sound words out. You have to learn to trace certain words back to certain meanings. You have to learn how to drill down into, sink into, contemplate a text, follow a storyline. You have to learn how to think fictionally. This takes skill. It takes talent. You have to work at it. You have to develop it. You have to push yourself and strive to meet the author. The art of writing calls out for a commensurate art from the reader. It's pretty cool. So a lot of the time when I was a monk, and now as well, when people email me, a question I get, and the question I would get, was, I'm having a hard time seeing where compassion comes in Zen practice. The meditation hall is cold, nobody's talking to each other. Where is the compassion in all this? Where's the empathy in all this? Samurai Zen. I got that all the time. And to be honest, I never had a great answer. But the practice was so valuable and so important to me that I tried to shoehorn some answer in there that had to do with the teachings or the life of the Buddha or some Zen master who showed compassion. But it never felt quite right. And I guess I was never fully honest with myself or these students, because the truth was, I was sitting there listening to them, really feeling what they were saying, and in a sense, I was reading them. That was where I had learned compassion and empathy, was through reading. One of the interesting things about learning to read books and read people and read the world is that it cultivates a curiosity in you, and that curiosity winds up providing you with more questions than answers. Instead of clamping down on one idea or story or belief system or practice as the truth, you can begin to see how different truths or stories or practices complement each other. Because the great thing about reading fiction, studying fiction, is not just that you learn empathy. A less commented upon, but I think equally important, crucial gift that fiction gives us is it educates us and puts in our intellectual bloodstream the very act of storytelling. And we begin to be able to recognize it and sniff it out wherever we see it. And we're less fooled by lies. We're less drawn in by the really bad narratives that our culture is teaching us, that the newspapers are feeding us, that our teachers are giving us, that our parents are giving us, that our coworkers are giving us, the lies, the storylines, the narratives. We can see through them. Again, not to pick on Donald, but he had bought into the idea that our teacher was, as he put it, the greatest living Zen Buddhist since Hakuin. And it was a story. It was a story he was telling himself. And as somebody who was suspicious of fiction, he was uneducated in the ways of fiction. He was unaware of how he had bought a story. He was stupid about stories. And this happens again and again with people who are inclined towards spiritual practices in certain religions, as they decide that they have found the final story. It may seem like this is not a very important topic, like especially to people who are drawn to spiritual work in a Zen video like this, but I've been listening to an audiobook, and the audiobook is called Reading Lolita in Tehran. It's a pretty amazing story about this woman who is teaching literature in Iran, and she's teaching it right when the Shah is being deposed. I think this is back in the 70s, and her world is completely changing, and her students are changing, and there are serious religious zealots, and they don't like literature, and they don't like the fact that she's teaching these books like The Great Gatsby and like Lolita. Now, you would think that a book like Lolita would not necessarily land with Iranian Muslim women. Like, why are they going to want to read a book about some English pervert gallivanting through superficial diner, Disney, McDonald's, Las Vegas-y, pop culture saturated, corrupted America while he has sex with a 13-year-old girl? Like, why would conservative Muslim women want to read this book? Well, this author of this book gives the most amazing, beautiful, and subtle interpretation of Lolita. And she starts to show how in the negative space cast by the domineering patriarchal narrative of the point of view of the book, which is told from Humbert Humbert, the rapist point of view, in the negative space, we can see glimpses and hints of Lolita, of the victim. She's totally controlled by Humbert Humbert, and the narrative is totally controlled by Humbert Humbert, and yet she slips out from the shadows and she shows her face. Lolita does, at various points in this novel. And the author of Reading Lolita in Tehran is drawing a parallel between Lolita and the women of Iran who are being forced to wear veils, who are being forced to cover their heads, who are being pulled into secret bunkers for weeks on end and being interrogated and tortured in some cases, having their rights taken away simply because they had like a strand of hair out of place, or because they were caught on the street without someone who was either their brother, their father, or their husband. And she's saying, women who go through this, who live through this kind of religious oppression by these narrow-minded theocrats who only have one story, and within the realm of that one story, women are second, third, fourth-class citizens. She said they understand this character of Lolita, and they see her. They see her through Humbert's moments when he actually speaks about her in a tender way. They see her when Humbert tells us how she's crying in the corner. They see her when Humbert tells us how Lolita had some burst of anger because Humbert cheated her in some way. They see her humanity. Didn't know this was going to get political, but I think the middle way that Buddhism teaches, it suggests certain things to me politically. It suggests that there's a middle space, there's a middle way, there's a circle of profound negation right in the middle. And when we enter that space, we let go of our ideas that we're right, that we have the one true story. And in that space, that democratic circle where everybody steps in and is together, we all have a place. Nobody's story gets to win over anybody else's story. And I believe we have to keep that space open. A place where we can meet and come together. And just the act of meeting and coming together gives rise to a new truth, a greater truth, a better truth. So even if it's that's a really bad example. That's a horrible example. But we read stories, we absorb stories, crawl inside the character's skin. We become less narrow-minded. We become more open. We become less convinced of the stories that we tell ourselves. I find that a practice of reading and writing fiction and stories is a great complement to the practice of sitting still, breathing deeply, dissolving all narrative structures through this activity of meditation. I find that they're really complementary practices, and maybe you will too. Hey, thank you for listening to me today as I walked through this forest. If you like what you see here on this channel, I'm going to put a link to my PayPal donation button as well as my Patreon page in the description for this video below. I really appreciate your support. Thank you. And hit the subscribe and hit the like button, because that stuff helps me move up in these totally incomprehensible YouTube algorithms, which make absolutely no sense to me. I don't know. Ciao.